At 26,000 feet over Germany, a B-17 flying fortress took a burst of cannon fire so severe that half its fuselage peeled open like a crushed soda can. Oxygen tanks ruptured, hydraulic lines snapped, and fuel sloshed against torn aluminum skins. Yet the bomber kept flying. The crew survived. The aircraft landed. And when investigators asked how, they found something almost unbelievable. One hidden design feature, a small system of vents and pressure pathways, had kept the aircraft from bursting apart in midair. What most pilots never knew is that one engineer had quietly built a way for a dying airplane to breathe. And that secret is the reason hundreds of crews lived to see home again. Tonight, we tell the story of the little-known engineering trick that made the B-17 nearly indestructible. The story of the B-17 flying fortress does not begin with heroism or mythology. It begins with fear, not the fear of battle, but the quieter, colder fear that creeps into a company's bones when it realizes it is bleeding to death. Boeing, in the early 1930 seconds, was not the titan of aviation we imagine today. It was fragile, vulnerable, a giant with hollow ribs. The Great Depression gutted the aviation industry like a slow-moving knife. Commercial airlines cut routes or collapsed outright. Military budgets were slashed to bone. Factories that once reverberated with the clang of metal and the hiss of pneumatics now stood half-lit, half-empty, half-dead. Engineers who had once dreamed of radically new airframes were now sweeping floors or sharpening tools just to keep from being laid off. Boeing executives gathered in conference rooms that smelled of dust and stale coffee, staring at financial reports with lines that only dipped downward. Workers whispered in break rooms about which departments might be cut next. Supervisors rehearsed speeches to their teams, each one beginning with, "We're doing everything we can," and ending with, "I don't know what happens next." It felt like waiting for a final heartbeat. So when the U.S. passed, Army Air Corps announced a competition for a new long-range bomber, one that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything in existence. Boeing didn't see it as a contract. They saw it as oxygen. But the Army's requirements teetered on the edge of impossible. They wanted a bomber that could outrun pursuit aircraft. They wanted a bomber that could cross half the continent, strike its target, and return home. They wanted defensive firepower so intimidating that enemy fighters would think twice before attacking. They wanted something that sounded more like science fiction than military procurement. Most manufacturers shook their heads. The requirements were absurd. The future war would be fought with modest, simple, short-range bombers. At least, that was the safe bet. But Boeing had no room for safe bets. Deep inside Boeing's design offices, long rooms filled with drafting tables, mechanical pencils, protractors, slide rules, and men who felt the weight of their company on their shoulders, the first sketches of the Model 299 took shape. Engineers worked late into the night, their eyes burning under desk lamps, their fingers smudged with graphite. Every one of them knew that the aircraft they were designing was either Boeing's salvation or its gravestone. The result was unlike anything seen before. When the Model 299 rolled into daylight for the first time in 1935, it didn't just look advanced, it looked alien. The crowd that had gathered to watch its reveal fell silent. Even its silhouette seemed predatory. 4 powerful engines lined its wings, its fuselage stretched sleek and lean compared to the stubby, slow bombers of the era. Gun blisters dotted its surface like the spines of a defensive creature. One reporter whispered, "It looks like a flying fortress." Within days, the name stuck to the aircraft like armor. Test flights proved the days. Nickname well earned. The Model 299 climbed like a startled animal, far faster than anything with a comparable wingspan had any right to climb. It moved with a confidence that unnerved even its own test pilots, who were used to fighting sluggish, underpowered bombers through the air. Each flight set new expectations. Each performance stunned Army observers, who had quietly assumed Boeing was finished as a company. For a moment, the future looked bright, blindingly bright. Then came the flight that changed everything. On the day of the official Army evaluation, the Model 299 fired up its engines, propellers chopping the air into shimmering discs. Army officers, reporters, mechanics, and Boeing executives lined the runway. The future of the company rested on this aircraft, performing exactly as expected. It didn't. The great machine lifted into the sky with its usual elegance, but only moments later its nose pitched too sharply upward. Observers gasped. The aircraft stalled, rolled, and plunged into the ground in a roaring fireball that sent a mushroom of smoke spiraling upward. When the flames finally died and rescue crews reached the wreckage, 2 men, including Boeing's most skilled test pilot, were dead. The cause was found quickly. The elevator control locks had not been removed. Human error, not a design flaw, not an aerodynamic failure. But the Army didn't care. They had witnessed an aircraft that looked too complicated, too sophisticated, too dangerous in the hands of ordinary pilots. In an instant, the Model 299 went from miracle to mistake. Contracts evaporated. Rivals, who had played it safe with smaller twin-engine designs like the Douglas B-18, won by default. Boeing's masterpiece had been buried before it could even breathe. Yet somewhere in the embers of that wreck, hope remained. Boeing's engineers, bruised but not beaten quietly, continued refining the design with what meager resources they had. They refused to let the Model 299 die. They made improvements. They corrected weaknesses. They prepared for a moment when the world would need the aircraft desperately. And at the center of this renewed effort stood a man who rarely sought attention, Edward Curtis Wells. Wells was young, brilliant, and unnervingly perceptive. He was not loud. He was not charismatic. But he saw things other engineers didn't. While others obsessed over horsepower and wing loading and drag coefficients, Wells studied something far more abstract: the invisible physics lurking inside an aircraft in battle. He studied pressure. He became obsessed with it. He scoured crash reports from earlier wars, circling fragments on photographs and marking pressure lines on diagrams. He read obscure aerodynamic theses that most engineers ignored. He dissected every instance where a bomber had been hit by cannon fire, trying to understand not the hole itself, but what had happened inside the aircraft milliseconds later. He noticed something strange, something terrifying. Bombers didn't die from being hit. They died from what happened inside them after the hit. A single 20mm shell could enter a fuselage, explode, and create a pressure spike that ruptured fuel tanks 3 compartments away. A cannon blast in the tail could send a shockwave that cracked oxygen bottles like eggs. Even flak bursts near the wings could destroy them without touching them, simply by forcing abrupt pressure changes through internal ribs. Aircraft were giant drums of trapped air, and explosions inside drums don't behave gently. Wells realized that most aircraft weren't failing from structural weakness, but from internal overpressure. They were, in essence, bursting from the inside like sealed containers struck with a hammer. So one day, in a meeting filled with exhausted engineers, he said the words that would define his legacy: "You cannot stop damage. You can only direct it." The room fell silent. Wells proposed something revolutionary: a bomber with hidden venting systems, pressure release pathways, channels to route destructive force away from critical structures, controlled fail points that would rupture first to protect essential systems. He wanted to build a bomber that could breathe. It sounded insane. Pilots wanted armor, not vents. The Army wanted stronger skins, not intentional weak spots. But Wells pushed. He didn't argue loudly. He argued with logic, with physics, with evidence. And slowly, the design team began to understand. A bomber that tried to resist pressure would die. A bomber that relieved pressure could survive. So Wells began designing subtle features that the public would never notice: microscopic vent gaps along internal ribs, pressure equalization slots behind fuel tanks, pathways in the fuselage frame to direct explosive energy outward, bulkheads built to flex, skins designed to tear in safe directions. These systems were unseen, unadvertised, uncelebrated, but they were transformative. By the time the improved Model 299, now designated the B-17, rolled off the production line, Wells's invisible fingerprints were woven into every inch of its internal structure. Crewmen climbing into the first operational B-17 seconds saw only the obvious features: the polished aluminum finish, the formidable armament, the 4 powerful engines. They admired the robustness of the landing gear, the elegant shape of the wings, the massive bomb bay ready to deliver destruction. None of them glanced at the tiny vent ridges near the wing roots. None questioned the unusual seams in the fuselage walls. None noticed the carefully engineered gaps behind the fuel bladders. That was the point. Those features weren't meant to be noticed. They were meant to save lives. And soon, they would. When B-17 seconds began flying combat missions over Europe in 1942 and especially in 1943, the war they entered was nothing like the simulations they trained for. Once beyond the English coastline, the air turned hostile. Jagged black flak bursts clawed at formations. Cannon fire from swarming German fighters sliced through aluminum like it was wet paper. Yet something strange began happening. B-17 seconds started coming home when they had no right to. One returned with half its tail shredded. Another limped back with an entire nose section missing. Some landed with dozens, sometimes hundreds of cannon and flak holes. Photographs showed daylight shining cleanly through both sides of the fuselage. Crews joked that the B-17 wasn't built, it was carved from iron. Others whispered that it had a guardian angel. Ground crews touched the battered skins with reverent disbelief. But engineers at Boeing saw something different. They saw the vent channels Wells had designed doing exactly what they were meant to do. Every time a fuel tank was hit and didn't explode inward, every time an oxygen bottle ruptured without taking the entire fuselage with it, every time a shockwave exited the aircraft, instead of bouncing around inside like a trapped beast, they saw his systems quietly, invisibly, saving the day. By late 1943, the daytime bombing raids reached their darkest chapters. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, Münster. Missions so brutal that entire squadrons were wiped from the sky. Luftwaffe pilots fired heavier cannons, twin-engine fighters joined the attacks, and flak batteries grew more deadly by the week. B-17 seconds were being punished in ways no aircraft had ever been punished before, and yet they kept coming home. Some flew hundreds of miles while bleeding fuel from a dozen punctures but not exploding because pressure had been allowed to escape. Some held together despite catastrophic internal damage because Wells had designed fail paths. Mechanics began to say, the B-17 wants to live. What they didn't know was that the B-17 didn't survive because it was magically strong. It survived because one soft-spoken engineer gave it a way to exhale death instead of inhale it. But the storm was only beginning. The Luftwaffe was preparing new weapons, 30mm cannons capable of ripping bombers apart from the inside. Rockets designed to detonate near the fuselage and create crushing pressure waves. The B-17's greatest test was about to begin. And no one, not the pilots, not the commanders, not even the enemy understood the hidden system that would decide whether thousands of airmen lived or died. Only Edward Curtis Wells did. And the skies over Europe were about to prove him right. The B-17 had already gained a reputation for being tough, but reputations in war are fragile things, built on rumor and destroyed by reality. And nothing tested that reputation more brutally than the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, a raid so catastrophic, so horrifying, that veterans would later say it was the day every flyer in the 8th Air Force realized just how thin the line between survival and annihilation truly was. Many crews, it felt like flying straight into the mouth of hell. It was the 17th of August, 1943. The sky above England was deceptively peaceful, the kind of soft blue that made the contrails of climbing bombers look like chalk lines drawn by a giant hand. Hundreds of B-17 seconds gathered into formations stretching across the horizon. Engines thundered in synchronized waves. Crewmen checked ammunition belts, oxygen lines, parachute harnesses. The mission plan was ambitious, a double strike, Regensburg's aircraft factories, then Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants. 2 targets deep inside Germany, far beyond the safety of fighter escort. Today, though, we follow only one bomber, a fortress known to its crew and ground personnel as Royal Flush, a machine that had already taken more damage on previous missions than most aircraft could endure. Its nose art, a confident hand of playing cards, seemed almost arrogant against the grimness of what lay ahead. But Royal Flush carried a crew of tough, Men who had flown mission after mission into Germany's black heart and returned alive. They believed in their aircraft. They believed in one another. And as they took off that morning, none suspected that they were about to become the test subjects of a hidden design feature that would determine life or death. For the first 2 hours of the mission, the formation climbed steadily, pushing eastward. Airmen sat tethered to oxygen lines, breathing the thin, icy air at altitude. The sun rose behind them, casting long golden rays across the glass, nose, and cockpit. The men inside Royal Flush felt the familiar mix of dread, boredom, and mechanical routine. They smoked cigarettes through oxygen masks, checked gauges, scanned for enemy fighters. They knew the Germans would come. The question was never if, but when. They found out sooner than expected. Somewhere over Belgium, the first contrails appeared on the horizon, dozens of thin, stabbing lines rising toward them. The Luftwaffe was already waiting. The intercom filled abruptly with shouted warnings. Bandits at 2 o'clock high. More at 10 o'clock. Closing fast. Then the sky erupted. W-190 dove in from above like diving hawks, their 20mm cannons blazing. Shells burst against the formation, sending shrapnel slicing through aluminum skins. B-17 shuddered as chunks of fuselage and wing tore away. Some bombers exploded instantly. Others fell into slow, spiraling descents, trailing smoke like wounded giants. Royal Flush was in the thick of it. The first shell struck the left wing root, exploding with a flash that rocked the aircraft. The force tore open the leading edge, exposing ribs and fuel plumbing. The wing flexed violently. The crew felt the entire airframe lurch sideways. The co-pilot keyed the intercom, voice strained. "We're hit. Checking fuel tanks." Before they could finish the assessment, a second burst hit the tail section. A 20mm round exploded near the horizontal stabilizer, tearing a hole so large daylight poured through it. The tail gunner screamed that he'd lost half his control surface. He wasn't exaggerating. The left elevator was hanging by a single spar, flapping like a piece of torn canvas. Then came the third hit. A cannon shell slammed into the bomb bay area, tearing through the aluminum skin and detonating against one of the oxygen bottles. The explosion sent razor-sharp fragments ricocheting through the compartment. White vapor filled the fuselage. A burst of pressure radiated outward like a pulse. The entire aircraft shook so violently that Royal Flush's pilot thought they had lost the wing outright. Inside the bomber, chaos reigned. Control cables vibrated. The fuselage groaned. The left wing dipped, threatening a stall. Air whistled through new holes, littering the skin. The pressure spike from the oxygen explosion should have torn through the fuselage like a sledgehammer. The fuel tanks should have ruptured and ignited. The wing spar should have failed. The aircraft, by all logic, should have snapped in two. But Royal Flush didn't fall. In the moments that followed, the crew braced for the fatal shudder. The one that meant structural failure was imminent. Several men prepared to bail out. The pilot steadied the controls with trembling hands, waiting for the end. And then, nothing happened. Or rather, something happened that shouldn't have. The bomber stabilized. It didn't make sense. They had been hit in 3 critical locations. They had lost part of a wing, part of the tail, and a major oxygen bottle had exploded inside the fuselage. They should have been spiraling downward, burning, breaking apart. Instead, Royal Flush held her course, wobbling but steady, bleeding altitude, but still flying. The crew was stunned. The pilot muttered under his breath, "How the hell are we still in the air?" He wasn't the only one asking that question. The Luftwaffe fighters began circling for the accomplice. Another pass, expecting the B-17 to slow, stall, or explode. But Royal Flush refused to die. Even with dozens of new holes, she moved with a strange stability, as if the air itself was helping hold her together. What none of the men aboard realized was that the bomber's hidden anatomy was working exactly as Wells had designed it. The explosion in the bomb bay had triggered pressure relief seams beneath the oxygen tanks, allowing the shockwave to escape downward into the slipstream, rather than ricochet through the fuselage. The blast that tore through the wing root was venting through pre-designed channels behind the fuel bladders. The shredded tail was flexing without snapping because Wells's team had built micro-expansion joints inside the stabilizer ribs points designed to flex rather than transmit force into the center spar. The crew had no idea. They only knew they were still flying. The fight wasn't over. German fighters returned in waves, peppering the formation with more cannon fire. Royal Flush took hit after hit, each impact sending violent tremors through the airframe. But each time, the bomber absorbed the damage in ways the crew couldn't explain. Fuel leaked from the left wing, but it didn't ignite. Vapor trails spilled from ruptured lines but vented harmlessly into the wind. The ruptured oxygen system should have turned the fuselage into a deadly pressure trap, but instead the compartment depressurized evenly, preventing catastrophic failure. Inside the cockpit, the pilot looked at the instruments and shook his head. Airspeed was dropping. The altimeter unwound slowly, but the wings were still attached. The tail was still holding, and the engines, battered but loyal, still roared. "Keep her steady," he said softly. "She wants to fly." Below, villages and fields passed under the wounded bomber. Above, the sky boiled with contrails and smoke trails from dying aircraft. Royal Flush was not alone in her suffering. Across the mission, dozens of B-17 seconds were taking similar punishment, but a strange pattern was emerging. Many that should have been lost were still flying. Far away, back in Seattle, engineers began receiving combat reports that made almost no sense. Photos of B-17 seconds returning with half their fuselage missing. Reports of oxygen explosions that did not destroy the aircraft. Notes from pilots describing internal blasts that looked and felt like they should have been fatal. The engineers stared at these reports with mounting astonishment. Wells's venting system wasn't just performing well, it was performing better than theory predicted. The engineers gathered in conference rooms, spreading out photographs across tables. They traced blast patterns. They examined deformation lines. They compared before and after damage reports. They measured the shape of holes, the angles of tears, the way panels had blown outward rather than inward. Every photo told the same story. The vent channels were working flawlessly. When a cannon shell entered the wing, the shockwave bled through the vent cavities rather than hammering the main spar. When fuel tanks were punctured, pressure equalized so quickly that explosive force dissipated before it could ignite vapor. When an oxygen tank ruptured, the blast traveled along escape paths. Wells had carved into the bulkheads. The vent system turned internal explosions into survivable events. Boeing engineers had anticipated some of this, but the reality far exceeded expectations. Instead of containing damage, the venting networks were converting potentially fatal hits into manageable wounds. Instead of amplifying pressure spikes, the airframe was bleeding them off through carefully placed seams. The reports kept coming. A B-17 that limped home with 27 cannon hits, another that returned with a 6-foot gash in its fuselage, one that flew back across the channel with its entire nose section missing, the crew huddled behind open air, the bomber flying as if in defiance of physics. Every engineer who studied the reports reached the same hushed conclusion. The B-17 was not just tough, it was almost unnaturally resilient. And much of that resilience came from a design no pilot even knew existed. Wells said it best during a quiet moment in the engineering lab. "The airplane is doing what we built it to do. It's saving them because we accepted that it would be hit over and built for that reality." But the U.S. Army Air Forces did not publicize this. They didn't want to give the Germans insight into the bomber's internal anatomy. They didn't want to mention systems that crews might misunderstand or tamper with. So the secret stayed quiet, hidden, known only to Boeing, a handful of USAAF officers, and the engineers who had designed it. Out in the field, the reputation of the B-17 grew and grew. Pilots called it invincible. Mechanics called it stubborn. German pilots called it cursed. Luftwaffe intelligence officers who interviewed returning German crews struggled to understand how the bombers kept coming back. One German pilot famously said, "You cut off a B-17's head, and it still flies." Another said, "You can kill the crew, but not the machine." The truth lay hidden in the vents. Hundreds of B-17 seconds that should have fallen from the sky instead returned home because the pressure relief channels had done their job. Not perfectly, many airmen still died. Many fortresses still fell. But far fewer than should have. Far fewer than the physics of war suggested. Boeing engineers quietly sent new memos to air depots. Maintain vent channels carefully. Ensure nothing obstructs the relief paths. Inspect pressure seams after every mission. These notes were dry, technical, and carried no hint of the extraordinary stakes behind them. But the subtext was clear. The vent system was saving lives. As 1943 dragged into 1944, the war intensified. Germany's defenses grew more lethal. Flak batteries improved their aim. Fighter attacks became more coordinated. New Luftwaffe aircraft arrived with heavier cannon and more desperate tactics. The B-17's vent system, once a theoretical advantage, was about to face its ultimate test. A storm of fire so intense that many believed no bomber could survive it. Because the next missions into Germany wouldn't just be dangerous, they would redefine the meaning of survivability. And Wells's hidden vents, silent, unseen, unglamorous, would become the thin line between life and death for thousands of men. There are stories in aviation so unbelievable that even the men who lived them struggled to explain what happened. Stories where an aircraft should have died, should have broken apart, should have fallen from the sky in a rain of metal. Stories where physics, aerodynamics, and probability all say one thing, and reality stubbornly says another. Among these stories, one stands above the rest. One mission, one bomber, one crew. A survival so miraculous that it was photographed in disbelief, studied for decades, and whispered about by pilots who knew what it meant to live through the impossible. The bomber was the B-17 All-American, and on February 1st, 1943, it took damage that should have killed it 10 times over. The mission began like many others: cold air, tight formations, engines droning as the bombers climbed toward enemy territory. The All-American flew in the 414th Squadron, part of the 97th Bomb Group. Its crew was young, tough, and hardened by repeated missions over North Africa and the Mediterranean. They were used to hostile skies, used to flak, used to the relentless waves of German fighters. But nothing could have prepared them for what was coming. The target that day was Bizerte, a heavily defended port. The Luftwaffe knew they were coming. As the formation neared its objective, German fighters rose to meet them, streaking upward from airfields. Scattered along the coast, the sky erupted into a storm of gunfire, cannon bursts, and smoke trails. Fighters sliced through clouds of flak, forcing the B-17 seconds into defensive formations that tightened like clenched fists. Inside the All-American, the crew worked with mechanical calm. The pilot called out headings. The bombardier checked the Norden sight. The gunners scanned arcs of sky, watching for the first sign of incoming fighters. They knew the moment they released their bombs, the Luftwaffe would strike hard. They always did. And they did. Moments after the All-American dropped its payload, a swarm of German fighters dove in from above and behind, dozens of them. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds, and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds, tearing into the formation with terrifying precision. Cannon shells exploded across the sky. Tracers streaked past the windows. Several bombers went down immediately. Others caught fire and began slow, spiraling descents. The All-American took several hits in those first few seconds. A cannon shell tore through the right wingtip. Another blew open a section of fuselage near the radio room. The bomber shuddered, but held formation. Then came the moment that would be remembered for the rest of aviation history. A Bf 109 slashed through the formation in a head-on attack, firing its cannons as it passed. One shell exploded just beneath the cockpit, jolting the All-American violently. The German fighter, trailing smoke, overshot the formation, but instead of diving away, it banked sharply and attempted a desperate, suicidal second pass. It was a fatal decision. The crippled fighter came in too fast, too steep, unable to control its trajectory. It smashed directly into the All-American's fuselage, slicing through the tail section before flipping away and plummeting to the earth. The impact was devastating. The crew felt the collision like a hammer blow. The entire aircraft lurched wildly. The sound was monstrous, tearing metal, snapping beams, the scream of wind blasting into new openings. Inside the bomber, the men were thrown violently against bulkheads. The tail gunner was stunned as his entire compartment shook loose beneath him. The waist gunners watched in horror as daylight exploded through the fuselage where solid metal had been moments earlier. Half the rear fuselage was gone. Not damaged, not perforated, gone. The collision had nearly severed the aircraft. The tail section, hung by mere strips of aluminum thin metal edges, twisted like the torn tabs of a soda can. The vertical stabilizer was cracked. The horizontal stabilizer sagged dangerously. Control cables dangled in the freezing slipstream like spider webs. The B-17 should have broken apart instantly. It should have folded at the midsection. It should have disintegrated. The tail gunner screamed into his intercom that he could see open sky beneath his feet. What remained of the fuselage flapped and twisted in the wind. The structure flexed so violently that the gunner thought the tail would shear off at any second. The pilot took one look at the instruments and felt his heart freeze. He had no controls, no reliable readings, no real tail support. He immediately ordered the crew to prepare to bail out. Men grabbed parachutes. They scrambled to the openings. They felt the air whipping through the fuselage like a hurricane. But as they moved toward the exits, something eerie happened. The bomber stopped shaking. The violent flexing slowed. The groaning of metal eased. The tail, impossibly, stabilized. The pilot held the yoke tentatively. The aircraft responded, barely, weakly, but enough. For a long moment, the crew simply stared at one another in disbelief. The All-American was flying. Not well, not safely, not comfortably, but flying. The stunned navigator crawled toward the gap in the fuselage, a hole so large that a man could fall through it, and stared at the carnage. The open cavity extended nearly 6 feet wide. He could see the ground miles below, a shifting mosaic of desert scrub and rocky fields. The wind roared through the gap, tearing at maps and clothing. Loose equipment clattered around the fuselage. Yet the aircraft held its shape. What the men didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the only reason the All-American was still in the air was because the internal pressure had somewhere to go. If the structure had been airtight, if the bulkheads had been rigid, if Wells's venting system hadn't existed, the violent decompression from the collision would have ripped the airframe in half within seconds. But the pressure escaped. It vented through the wounds. It flowed through the designed pathways Wells had created. It equalized before catastrophic structural failure could occur. The absence of resistance saved the bomber. The seams flexed, the joints expanded, and instead of shattering, the airframe bent, absorbed, and held. The pilot made a critical decision in those moments. They would not bail out. They would try to bring the aircraft home. It was madness, but the All-American was giving them a chance. Slowly, deliberately, the pilot reduced speed. The co-pilot adjusted trim with whatever little control authority remained. The crew took positions near the edges of the broken fuselage, gripping whatever structure was left to prevent falling out. Luftwaffe fighters returned, circling the wounded bomber like vultures. But seeing the damage, the gaping hole, the dangling tail, the impossibility of the aircraft still being aloft, many refused to waste ammunition. The All-American was already dead. They assumed gravity would claim it soon enough. But gravity, for once, was not enough. Mile by mile, the crew coaxed the dying bomber toward home. Communication lines were severed. Instruments malfunctioned. The tail flapped like a wounded bird. The slightest turbulence sent tremors through the entire structure. The men held hands at one point, convinced the next gust would kill them. But the B-17 held together. When they reached their home field, the pilot lined up with the runway, sweat freezing against his skin. The landing gear deployed with a tortured cry of stressed hydraulics. As the wheels touched down, the crew braced for disaster. Instead, the bomber rolled to a stop, intact. Ground crews rushed toward the aircraft and stopped dead in their tracks. What they saw defied logic. The All-American looked like a corpse. Half its body was missing. The tail was connected by almost nothing. Crewmen could step through the fuselage without bending, and yet the bomber had flown hundreds of miles in that condition. How? The investigation revealed the answer. Wells's venting system had saved the All-American. Pressure that should have ripped the aircraft apart had vented through the openings and engineered relief channels. The rupture-tolerant seams allowed the airframe to flex rather than fail. The internal structure had survived because it was designed intentionally to release catastrophic forces instead of resisting them. It was one of the most extraordinary survival flights in aviation history. And it was only possible because of a hidden feature almost no pilot even knew existed. The story spread quickly among Allied air crews. Men whispered about the All-American with awe. Mechanics examined the bomber's remains with reverence. Pilots looked at their own B-17 seconds differently afterward, no longer as just machines, but as silent partners built to protect them against the unimaginable. But the shockwave didn't stop there. The Luftwaffe heard the story too, and it terrified them. German pilots had already noticed something strange. American bombers simply refused to die. They took hit after hit and kept flying. They lost engines, lost control surfaces, lost structural members, but stayed aloft. Luftwaffe intelligence officers scrambled to understand why. They interrogated pilots who returned from missions against the bombers. They examined wreckage from downed B-17 seconds. They studied gun camera footage that showed American bombers being shredded by cannon fire only to remain airborne. Their theories grew desperate. Some believed the Americans had developed a new alloy, something more resilient than anything Germany possessed. Others suspected the bombers were reinforced with internal armor plating. A few claimed chemical treatments had been applied to the metal skin to strengthen it. One officer even suggested the aluminum was laced with flexible titanium joints, but none of them guessed the truth. What they were fighting wasn't armor. It was emptiness. It was venting. It was the absence of pressure where pressure should have built. The Germans were firing high-explosive cannon shells designed to feed on enclosed compartments. But the B-17 didn't behave like a sealed structure. It behaved like an engineered pressure-release vessel. Every time a shell hit, the energy dissipated, bled off, and escaped, rather than ripping the aircraft apart. The Luftwaffe couldn't understand it. They couldn't counter it. And slowly, very slowly, the morale of German fighter pilots began to erode. They were fighting an aircraft that didn't follow the rules, an aircraft that refused to die, a metal beast that kept coming long after it should have fallen. The psychological impact was profound. German pilots became hesitant to make close-range attacks, convinced the bombers could absorb punishment endlessly. Some broke off engagements prematurely. Others refused to believe that a bomber with catastrophic damages could still return fire until it did. Meanwhile, the opposite effect took hold among American crews. They saw the photos. They heard the stories. They watched the All-American roll across the airfield, its tail nearly severed, and realized that their aircraft was capable of miracles. And that changed everything. The B-17 became more than a bomber. It became a symbol of reliability. A symbol of resilience, a symbol of hope in a war that was consuming young men faster than the factories could replace them. Years later, long after the war ended, long after the Luftwaffe ceased to exist, long after the thunder of the 8th Air Force had faded into history, the truth finally came out. Post-war engineering analyses revealed what the crews never fully understood: the B-17's venting system. Those hidden, quiet, almost invisible pathways had prevented dozens upon dozens of catastrophic failures. They had saved bombers whose fuel tanks should have detonated. They had saved crews whose oxygen systems should have exploded. They had saved aircraft whose fuselages should have imploded under sudden decompression. They had saved wings and tails that should have snapped off during structural overstress. The vents were not glamorous. They were not heroic. They were not celebrated, but they were life-saving. In interview after interview, engineers admitted the truth. The venting pathways had been a gamble, a calculated risk, a design philosophy that accepted damage as inevitable and built the aircraft not to resist it, but to survive it. And the man responsible for that quiet revolution? Edward Curtis Wells. He never bragged about it, never sought recognition, never asked for his name to be attached to the bomber's legend. When asked later in life why he designed the pressure release systems into the B-17, he gave only a modest answer. I knew the airplane would be hit, so I built it to take a hit. But history has a way of remembering the right people, even when they stay silent. Wells's work turned the Flying Fortress into exactly what its name promised, a machine that protected its crew with a kind of mechanical stubbornness unmatched in its era. A bomber built not just to fight, not just to kill, not just to reach a target, but to bring its men home. The B-17 returned thousands of airmen to their families, men who should have died but didn't. Men whose lives were saved by a hidden network of vents, channels, seams, and pathways they never knew existed. And in the end, that is the legacy of the Flying Fortress. Not the bombs, not the guns, not the rugged engines or the thick wings. Its true legacy is in the silence between explosions, the hidden breath of an aircraft designed to survive the unimaginable. A simple idea, born in the mind of a quiet engineer, carried across continents by rivets, steel, and courage. A secret system no one noticed, a trick no enemy understood, a gift that saved thousands. The B-17 did not simply endure the war. In one pressured vent after another, in one miraculous return after another, it changed it.